So we talked a lot about all these different pieces, where we put things. A couple of things, I'm going to hit some highlights here. So I've talked a lot about in here that one of the ways we can compromise networks, and we can also use it as a security device, is a switch. Most of our switches have the ability to take all of the traffic from that switch and mirror it onto a single port. So for diagnostics. Now, if I'm in there maliciously, that's not a good thing. But if I'm mirroring it out for the purpose of grabbing all the traffic and sending it out to this network analyzer so I can see what's going on in my network, that's a positive. That really is a positive. So if I can get in access to the core switches, the switches closest to the internet, if you want to think about it that way, then I can get almost all of the traffic for that network, and I can take a look at it. So the other model, or where we can put some things, so notice now we just really have something in line. In other words, we're tapping into it. So think of like the FBI tapping a phone line. They've just clamped onto it, and we're doing it this way. This has less overall coverage because I'm not getting anything except the information going in and out of that switch. And we tend to have a lot of switches. But it's also in some cases less noticeable. And again, if I'm doing it from a malevolent viewpoint, I can insert a device in line with a single computer or a set of switches, or, because people don't always hide things very well. Setting your server switch in an unlocked closet really doesn't do a whole lot if I'm allowed to wander around your building. So, again, another place we can put some of this. So, sensors, we can put sensors, and now we're starting, because the price of some of this stuff has come down, we're putting sensors and data collectors all over the place. So we're starting to get collections of data, and so we can put them in line. Sometimes they're a software agent. So we can start collecting data. And what we're trying to do is build that base point of what does our network look like today. Hopefully it's healthy. Hopefully it's working properly. What is it doing today? What is our data flows? How much data is moving around? What kind of data? And that gives us the ability then to look at what happens when something goes wrong. And so we can also add in filters and all different kinds of rules. So in this case, we've got a DMZ zone where we've got web servers and email, and here we have our internal applications. So these devices and sensors we're placing in are all over the place. So there's even services. So one of the things we talked about and we made you guys go do in class was you actually started with a DDoS attack. I had you ping continuously our server. And we didn't have enough people in enough places yet to affect our tiny old server. But if we could multiply that, and so now there are services you can actually rent a DDoS attack, and it is coming in terms of gigabits per second. It overwhelms your connections. It overwhelms your network connections. It overwhelms the server. In some cases, it overwhelms your internet service provider, and you don't have any way to really deal with it. So there are mitigators and hardware devices and software that we can actually use. There are companies that will specialize in doing that. So how do we start finding all that? And that event viewer on a local computer is really good. When we start looking at the logs out of all these sensors, out of all our switches, out of our routers, we end up with a tremendous amount of data. And if we got hired, and that's all we did, is we spent 40 hours a week scanning through this, we might be able to find something. But unfortunately, one of the problems we have is we don't have the ability to do that continuously. And so we're going to talk about some technologies that will help us do that. But some of the things we might look for. So maybe we have HR has contacted us about, who are we going to pick on today? Who looks guilty? Greasy, you're looking guilty today. So HR has contacted us about what you're looking for on the computer. Great. So we can go into those logs and we can look at, did you violate our privacy rights, or did you violate our policies? Did you install something you shouldn't have? Maybe we're looking for, did you accidentally get software installed on a drive-by? So those logs inside that computer and the logs inside our routers can tell us a lot about what you do. Oftentimes, weirdly, one of the things I get approached with is angry spouses or boyfriend girlfriends, and they want to have me tell them how they can find information about what's my wife or what's my husband doing on that computer. Are they out there on an online dating site? No, not. But if I tell you how to go into your logs and see what's installed and where you go on that computer, you can probably find some of that out yourself. I actually had one a couple of days ago with a governmental agency I do a little bit of work with. And I went in and they wanted a specific item at Walmart. They're going to put some large TVs on. And I was like, here, let me show you the ones we use like here that are fairly reasonable. And so I went to Walmart, and as soon as I hit the search button at Walmart, because it stores all these things in cookies, the very first thing that shows up, is anybody going to be offended? I hope not. But the first thing that shows up is the phrase nipple cream. And I went, whoa, wait a minute. Then I realized the computer I had borrowed was actually for a young lady who had recently given birth. And apparently, but when you first look at that, that's all stored. We can go into those logs and we can find out what they were looking for. So, are they allowed to shop on their lunch hour? Apparently they are. So, but all of that stuff is going into those logs. So I could also find it if they had a content management system. And it's one of those phrases that you just go, that just seems weird, right? Not something most of us would look at, especially on the job. So we can look at all these logs that we have, all this data we have, but the other thing we need to do, so here we can get them from all the security devices, so our routers and firewalls, we can see IP addresses, who's logging in, who's tried to log in, what we've blocked, and hopefully those block lists are pretty high. If we log into our spam filter for email, you can see that how much stuff we've pulled out of emails. And so most places that have a spam filter, and I don't know what our statistics are on this campus at this point, but most places I've been at and looked at their spam filters and their filtering rules, you're only seeing about 3 to 10% of the emails that actually hit the email servers. Most of it is getting rejected because it's got some really horrible stuff. So you want to log through and you go, man, I see what's going on with this particular provider. What are we getting hit with? And the other thing we look at then is, are there emails that are not getting through? And so the spam rules are kind of a weird, murky area that companies buy from blacklist services and whitelist services. In other words, known good and known bad emails. Weirdly, at least in our state, one of the places that continually lands on these blacklist sites, so we have to make exceptions, are the Nebraska.gov sites. And so I have seen that quite a bit in different courthouses and different governmental agencies where we've had to change and open some things manually so they can get emails from the Treasury Department, for example. Yikes. So we get all this information. We're trying to figure out what we do with it. So things like whitelisting. So you've heard that term, and I say it quite often, the idea of whitelisting. Those are applications, those are vendors, those are users that we're allowing to work and function. So we may put a whitelist on your computer and say only these pieces of software can be on there. So other things you may run into. Media. Removable media is a scary thing in our world. Flash drives are everywhere. I reach in my pocket, and maybe I'm just the nerd, but I have 2 flash drives in here in my pocket right now. This one actually has some malicious content in it, or could be used for that. So one of the things that's on here is I can boot to this drive and break your password on almost any Windows machine, including Windows Server. Well, if I have physical access and I have your password, that's kind of ugly. So how do I stop people from doing this? So again, from a management side, we have to make some decisions. Do we even allow removable media? A lot of businesses rely on these for their quote-unquote backup. So maybe we need some better strategies for them. These are handy. It's handy to move data from place to place. But I can tell you over and over and over again, if we have these and I go throw this out in the hallway, somebody's going to plug this in. They don't know who it came from. If I go to a business and I scatter some of these all over the parking lot, I guarantee somebody in that business is going to plug them in. And we've tested that. I had a student last year test this at their business because they told me, no, the people I work with at the hospital here in town, for example, will never do that. Try it. And all he did was write a little script in there that, basically said, here's my name and next class he comes in and goes, oh, they plugged them all in really quickly. Yeah, people are creatures of habit. So we have all this data. Maybe we need to block some of it out. So, biggest problem, we have so much data now, we need to figure out a way to manage that data. Even when you start doing research for a student project, look how much data you can go grab now. How do I start weaning that down and making it usable? So, there are companies out there that do log analyzers. So you're sending their data to them if it's on the web product, or you have a tool that's been updated. And so now you can get some usable data, that dashboard view of, hey, every day this week has been fairly normal, except all of a sudden on Friday we had a giant spike in data usage. What was that from? Why were there all these requests trying to send data out of my servers on this particular day? So it can give us some usable data, and there's a lot of tools out there. We talk a little bit about in here about virtualization, and I really wish we could have like 12 more classes so we could do one class just on virtualization technologies and one class on cloud and one class on all different kinds of things. We don't. But virtualization is the new policies and the new world we're living in, because most businesses don't want to build a physical box for every application they do. So they have a couple of choices. We can run a server, a physical server, and we can run all different kinds of apps on it at the same time. That tends to lead to some issues. So apps don't always play well with each other. And if one app crashes and breaks that server, it then takes out every service it's being used for. So virtualization is really a great tool. I can have one physical machine, and now I have lots of virtual copies of a server running, and I can independently specialize those. So one is the time clock app running on one server. If it fails, I can restart it. I can move it to another server. So that entire operating system is sitting there virtualized. It's a great technology. There are some downsides to it. Well, the downside is really, well, let's talk about the hypervisor and then I'll talk about that. So there's type 1 and type 2, and I've got a video actually available if you want to go watch it, where a young woman from, I believe it's IBM, is talking about virtualization. And what I love, and I wish we could figure it out, is she's writing on a glass screen, and then it flips the image so you can actually see it correctly, which is pretty cool. So type 1 hypervisors. So type 1 says, I don't have an operating system on the box. So I have a computer tower like this or a server mounted. There is nothing on there at the base level other than that hypervisor. So that hypervisor may be VMware, it may be Hyper-V from Microsoft, whatever version you like. It's on there, and then there's all these guest operating systems sitting there. Type 2 is like your VirtualBox. You've got Windows running, or Linux, or whatever you've got running. You run the hypervisor on top of that, and then you have those guest operating systems. So from a performance standpoint, type 1s are much faster and better at resources, because you don't have the overhead of this host operating system, and these are directly on bare metal. The downside to this is this hypervisor, there's nothing between the hypervisor and all of the hardware. So if I can corrupt the hypervisor, or if there's an update that doesn't work right, it can be much more dangerous, because in here you have that host in between. I waffle, and I've installed them both ways in a lot of different places, and we've set them up there's advantages to both. The biggest disadvantage I've run into over here, especially running Hyper-V and Microsoft, is Microsoft has decided we're going to push out updates, and we're going to force you to reboot the server, and you don't have a choice. It just happens. Great. When that happens, every one of those guest operating systems also flops offline. And so I just had that happen a couple of weeks ago at an installation. And we actually, because we've got some security software setting on this HostOS, is why we did that. It sets here, so there's some logging and some other traffic control. And then up here are setting some applications that actually connect to law enforcement and some other services. So now I have one server here that decided it needed to reboot, and it took out 8 more servers. And when it came back up, Windows didn't play nice, and stuff didn't exactly work well on the update. Thank you. Thank you, Windows. So it's an issue. I have also found it appears to be, because this hypervisors because they're sitting on top of this operating system, we have an issue where I shouldn't be able to see anything from guest 1 to guest 2, unless I purposely create it that way. There are more security flaws, at least it appears to me, with a type 2 getting data from one to the other. So each one of these containers, so all of your applications, your operating system, everything set in a container. And so when we did VirtualBox here, we created a virtual hard drive. On the production side, a lot of times we will actually use drives that are dedicated. And in fact, they're typically not even on the computer that's spinning these up. So these will have a fairly small hard drive, and then we have a large storage pool over here where we store all of that data. And so we've got some very fast connections between them. And what that lets us do is move those containers from one place to the other. So this leads to some interesting things. We can actually do what's called VDI, or virtual desktop. And we've tried it here, and some of you may have seen it in our library a couple of years ago. For whatever reason, it didn't work really well. So I don't know if it was a setup installation, because companies all over the place use it all the time. In our instance, it wasn't really effective. But you have a computer that you're logging into remotely. And so now we have things like Windows Azure services, and you can actually create a desktop in Windows Azure, and you're logging into that desktop. You're not logging into your local computer. So this is a really great security tool so that you can get into a desktop from anywhere, no matter where you're sitting at in your business, whether you're at home sometimes, and it's actually running on a server sitting there. And so that server has to be robust enough to spin up enough virtual desktops, but it gives us that ability to centrally manage. So if I need to do Windows updates, I do it on one machine instead of a couple hundred. The machines here really are running a very lightweight environment. So it's actually a great tool. A lot of large corporations are doing that. I think you're going to see this more and more often. You're going to be able to, instead of buying a computer, you're going to be able to buy access, and you actually can now, to a Windows service on whatever tablet you happen to have. So if I've got a Windows tablet, or I've got a Chrome tablet, or even, heaven forbid, an Apple tablet or something, I can buy services, log into, and it's a Windows desktop running somewhere else. So it really is a great security tool. The ones, typically, as soon as you log out, that process stops, and the next person gets a brand new, fresh experience. So it allows us a lot of flexibility. So there's good things. There's a lot of good things to virtualization. Well, we cut down on the number of servers physically we have. Now, it does lead to a problem that I've ran into with businesses who are a little too cheap. They go, well, man, I can virtualize everything and put it on one server. What happens if that server physically breaks? Oh. So you typically need to have some redundancy in hardware. So you may go from 100 servers to 10, but you wouldn't want to go from 100 servers to one physical machine and shove it all in there. So fewer physical servers. Now, while it says it can reduce costs, you also have the cost of, so VMware is not cheap, unfortunately. So you have the cost of that, and you have licensing costs depending on what operating system you're running on. So Microsoft, for a typical Windows Server installation with no additional pieces to it for 4 cores, I think right now is about $1,000. It can cost that change a little bit over, but it also allows, and they call it live migration, so that virtual machine goes from one physical host to another. If something does physically go wrong, maybe we're just reallocating resources. So you can move them from one machine to another. There are a lot of security advantages. So I can test things. That's one of the things I use VirtualBox a lot for, is I test. I install software. Does it break? I can grab an image of a desktop at a business, update it to the latest version of Windows, and try to see, hey, does it break the ERP software? And Windows has been known to do those kinds of dumb things. Sometimes Windows on its own. Windows will fix one problem and cause 10 more. So it allows us some security that way. It allows us to create snapshots. So we can run some backup software, and we can take snapshots of what's going on that server at various points. So a lot of places, I've got them set up where we're doing 15 or 30-minute snapshots. It captures exactly what's happening at that server at that particular moment. If 5 minutes later, that server crashes because somebody tried to install something, or maybe a piece of memory died, or whatever happens, we can go back 5 minutes, or we can go back 30 minutes, or whatever those intervals are, and I can restart them. So it's got a great advantage that way. It makes life a lot easier when we're updating things, because I can try that update, test it out, put it out there. So it sounds like it's great, except there are security holes like there are on anything. So now I have security issues of, can one guest see another guest? So we also have to worry about that. The other issue is now it's too easy to make virtual machines, so we run into configuration issues. So you have to really document what's going on and kind of sketch it out, because you can end up with this mix match of VMs all over the place. Nobody's managing them. It can lead to licensing issues. And one of the things you don't want is Microsoft to come in and say, hey, you owe us a couple $100,000. I've had that with AutoCAD, and it's not a pleasant experience. So there is some more issues in terms of organization. You have to keep track of all these details, and setting it up is a little more complex in terms of IP address management and software management. But I think the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. For the most part, I don't make recommendations for any business at this point that doesn't involve virtualization. It's just kind of what has happened in the world. And the really great thing, if I'm willing to pony up the money for Microsoft Server, which I kind of bagged on for the price and some security things, they actually include, though, you have the ability to run two licensed versions at the same time by purchasing one. So it does have a nice piece there. The other thing that is really nice, although I don't like it as well as VMware, is they include Hyper-V for free with the server operating system. So kind of a balancing act there. If you had unlimited money, probably wouldn't. So we've now got kind of some interesting choices happening in the world, and you guys are using them without even realizing it. When you go get your email, we don't have an email server on our campus any longer. It's out there floating somewhere in the quote-unquote cloud. When you guys log into Blackboard, well, Blackboard used to be hosted in a physical server in Virginia, in a hosting center. Well, Blackboard, like a lot of other vendors, has said, it doesn't make any sense for us to own our own hosted center. We're going to deploy out on the Amazon Web Cloud. And so they've off-sourced all their data. Netflix, all the engineering, management, everything except the actual storing of the videos for Netflix is now hosted on Amazon Web Services because it didn't make sense for them to build data stores and build all this equipment and have to continue to update. So for a lot of businesses, this on-premise model doesn't really work very well anymore. It's cheaper for them to go outside to the cloud and find storage, to find processing, to find services. So maybe we don't want to have a CRM, customer relationship management system. I can go to salesforce.com, I can sign up, and I can put as many users as I want in there. Maybe I want to use something like Microsoft Project, so I can go out to monday.com, or Microsoft itself actually has Project Online. And I pay for that service as I consume it. So from the initial standpoint, it seems cheaper. You're paying for how much resources you're using. And there's a lot of studies about things like email hosting. So most of the studies for email hosting using Microsoft Exchange say, well, hosting Exchange is expensive. Licensing is very expensive. And by the time you deploy it and the hardware and everything to deploy, it takes about 15 to 20,000 users to reach that break-even point where over a couple of years it's cheaper to maintain your own than it is to just outsource it. So there's some convincing dollars out there for a lot of these. So you pay as you need those resources. And in some cases, one of the best things is you can then choose what level of resources. So maybe your company in the COVID era has struggled and you've got to lay off half your workforce. You can reduce the number of licenses you have. If I've bought physical hardware and bought those licenses, I probably can't do that. So it gives us a lot of flexibility that we don't have. So there's a lot of terms in here you're going to read. So public cloud, private cloud, hybrid clouds. Public cloud is services like iCloud. So anybody can get access to it. Yes, you are compartmentalized. So a private cloud, that means you're just allowing your employees or your users to access the hardware on your own server. So really, we talk about the cloud. All the cloud is you're accessing somebody else's server. The cloud means you really don't know where it's at or where it's at and all the details behind it. You're just throwing your data out there. So that leads to all these different models here. Security as a service, infrastructure, platforms, software as a service. And I think we're going to see more and more and more of this type of model. Hardware is expensive, and for most businesses, bringing in that initial expense is pretty onerous. So I worked a while ago with a client, and I gave some consulting advice to them, and they were looking at a medical record storage system for a hospital. The company that they had been previously using, it ran only on some IBM hardware, and they were going to have to upgrade. The licensing for the database, a service called DB2, was really pricey. And so the server alone, to get it from IBM, the next model up to improve their performance, the server alone was $280,000. And it looked like a box, not much bigger than your computer here. And that was the base model. The upgrade to DB2 was another $55,000, if I remember that number correctly. So there was a lot of money. And we started looking at alternatives. And one of the alternatives in the medical field is using a service as a cloud. And for this size of hospital, when we started looking at the numbers and their data volume, it made a lot of sense for them. They didn't have to come up with $500,000 up front. If we looked at it at the 5 and 10 year marks, the costs were very similar to what they would have on their own. So for them, it made some sense. Lower initial costs, so we didn't have to spend all of our cash reserves, and we could use services as that volume depended on it. For a much larger hospital, if I go up to somewhere like Bryan LGH in Lincoln, that model probably doesn't work. Because if I look at their volume and what that cost is, it's probably cheaper for them to run and host their own software and their own data center. So it's one of those areas where you take that IT knowledge and you take that business knowledge and you can combine them to see which model and what fits you best in this environment. So, cloud has some issues. So, moving data offsite is scary because we lose control of it. So, most vendors will offer some guarantees, but we regularly hear one of the places a lot of password hacks come from is places that are hosted on Amazon Web Server or Microsoft Azure, kind of the two big players in the game. So I need to make sure that data is scored, it's secured, it's isolated. When we move data from our local place to there, it's all encrypted. So I do need to make sure that I have those conditions. It is scary to move away from hosting it where I can physically see, hey, it's in this box right there. One of the tools this is kind of handy to think about, though, is in most smaller organizations, they don't have a dedicated security person. And even if they did, they're going to have one person, maybe half-time working on stuff. Is that one person going to be aware of every threat that's out there in the world? No. If I go to somewhere like Amazon Web Services, they have probably 1,000 people working in security, and that's all they're doing is working on security for that entire organization. So sometimes we get a better service, honestly, external than what we could provide internal. So this last piece we're going to talk about really quickly is this idea of a software-defined network. So it doesn't mean your entire network is software. What it really means is, in most cases, that we have something called a single pane of glass. So a single pane of glass means if I log into one interface, I can see everything in my network on one control plane. It's all controlled. So everywhere from switches to access points to my firewalls, my routers, everything, I can all see it at one glance. And so the one I see around here a lot that kind of defines this for me is a company called Meraki. Meraki is a part of Cisco, and it's kind of their lower end, sort of. And when I say lower end for Cisco, that means, we're not spending $100,000 on each physical device. So that software development says, hey, I can figure out things like routing because I've got that idea of how this network is built, and I can look at it cohesively. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I will say one of the things it leads to is I'm buying all my hardware from one vendor in a lot of cases, and I also object a little bit to that. Great, Cisco Meraki stuff may be good. Is it the best access points out there? Maybe they don't fit the need. So if I substitute in something else, I lose that ability to control that entire network via software. Maybe they don't maybe I think Palo Alto makes the best firewalls. Well, I took out the Cisco Meraki, and I've changed my modeling a little bit there. So it's not a bad idea. I think one of the issues, though, is we rely on the sales guys a lot for this, and they will push this idea. You end up spending, in some cases, a lot more money than what you necessarily need, and you get kind of sold a bill of goods. And I actually saw that. I like Cisco Meraki stuff. It's not bad. For small businesses, I'm going to say, hey, go out and grab it. It's decent. It has a couple of problems, and a lot of the software-defined stuff does, in that you forget to pay your bill or it gets delayed, it shuts off, and that's not good. But I went into a library, and this library is not very big. And they had sold them this idea that, hey, we've got this entire pane of glass, we can monitor and we manage it. And they were charging this library thousands of dollars a month to monitor and manage this small network. And this building was about 3 of these classrooms together. It wasn't very big. And I believe they had 6 wireless access controllers they had sold them. They had sold them a 48-port switch with PoE that they didn't use except for those 6 devices. They had sold them one of the biggest routers that Meraki sells, outfitted them with all kinds of services. And it was about $100,000 installation for a small library that didn't really have the funds to do that. And I would argue that we could do something similar for probably a fifth of that cost and get the similar service. And in fact, one of the first things I did was actually take half of their access points offline because they were so close together, they were actually causing some issues by being that close. And the service, as far as I could see, because I went into the logs, once I got them to transfer it over so I had some control over it, I don't think they had ever actually been into that system for their thousands of dollars a month for maintenance. So it looks great on paper, but we have to always balance what we can do. For a small business, though, does this certainly make some sense? Yeah, but you have to know what's going on. And if you don't understand some of those basics, you get hooked. You're paying thousands of dollars a month for somebody to not do anything. And unfortunately, it happens quite a bit. So, go back, close. So I added some material today so we can talk about something that I think is probably the worst thing that's happened. So the last video is actually a cute little video about virtualization, but I want to talk about something called SolarWinds. Has anybody in here heard of SolarWinds? Oh, a couple of you are like, oh yeah. So SolarWinds, I think, as we're further and further investigating, is going to be one of the worst things that we have seen, and I don't think it's going to be very easy to clean up from. So, Microsoft president, I would value his opinion. I think he knows something. Largest and most sophisticated attack ever. And quite frankly, until this broke, I really loved SolarWinds, and I wanted to tell people to implement it, but the cost was too high. So most of the companies I do some consulting with are fairly small. They're not multi-billion-dollar companies. SolarWinds is a company that offers all kinds of control and monitoring services and software for a network. So Fortune 500 companies, government agencies all jumped on board and said, hey, this is a really great product. And for the most part it was until about a year ago. And about a year ago, this company got compromised. Part of the reason they got compromised is, remember what our question number 1 on our test is for the final? Passwords are BS. The password into some of their production servers from the outside you could access, as I am led to understand from several different sources, was administrator and the password SolarWinds123. So once SolarWinds was compromised, what they did is they actually added malicious code that's going to go out in the updates for some of their projects and that some people have bought. Hey, great, we tell you to go out and get your updates all the time, right? Now I've updated my servers and I just compromised my own accounts because I've given backdoor access into a third party. And we think it's probably a Russian hacking group. Nobody has jumped up and said, hey, it was us yet. And a very sophisticated attack. In fact, a lot of sources, when you start reading about this, they estimate that probably over 1,000 people were involved in this hack. So it's a large, very well run, possibly state sanctioned. Because if you look at all the companies, so it's pretty nefarious. Yeah, great. And nobody knew about it for quite a while. It lay out there, and people were in these systems. They were in our treasury. They were in all kinds of different corporations. So if you look at the list of the estimated 18,000 corporations and government entities, it's like a who's who of who's controlling your life. So, what do we do about it, though? Here's the real kicker. We know how they got in now. People have analyzed, figured out what happened, and I can close that original loophole. But they've been in your computer for 6 to 9 months. What else have they installed? What else have they done on that network? And once I'm in on the server level of your corporation, could I have distributed stuff to everything in that network? What do I trust at this point? Quite frankly, my advice to a company, as expensive it would be to nuke everything from orbit and start over. Because I can't tell you that a single desktop hasn't been compromised. We can now store code in things like access points and routers and firewalls. What has all been touched and been infiltrated? Because if I leave a single footprint in there, they can get back in. And that's part of the issue with administering these networks is the smallest access point can be how somebody gets in there. When we had a Target exposure a couple years ago, Target has now spent over $500 million trying to recover. It was through a thermostat controls. Yikes. So that simple exposure, it's why we do things like lockdown desktops. So you go out and you get a corporate job, and you get on your computer and you go, man, I really need to download the latest copy of Roboblox. You try to download it, it's going to yell at you and say, no, you can't do this. And there's a really good reason for that. Because we need to control that and try to mitigate what's going on. And now we think about all these systems that these are controlling. Payroll. The U.S. Treasury. The Justice Department. And it wouldn't take a whole lot to start changing how our life is running based on some of these events. In fact, just to our south, is anybody here from Kansas? Oh, good. All right, I can talk bad about Kansas. I am originally, so all right. So Kansas this week just finally announced what they think has happened with their funding for unemployment. So Kansas has already had some funding issues. Their system for unemployment has now spent at least $290 million in fraudulent claims, mostly to people in other countries. Oops. $290 million. There's some financial motive. My guess behind all the scene of this, there's both political and financial motivation. And I think as time goes on, we're going to see more and more of this because most companies aren't going to nuke this all from orbit. They're going to say, well, we removed that original access. 6 months from now, we're going to find out, oh, no, they'd installed something on a server hiding in a corner we didn't know about, or on a desktop hiding somewhere we didn't even know still existed, and it reinfected our entire network, gained them control and access into that network. And I think we're going to see this one be around for a long time. So I put some articles up. I am not saying that next week when we come in here for the on-campus class that there will be potentially a bonus quiz about SolarWinds hack. Is that subtle? And I will actually put up a quiz then for the online section also about. So I would ask that you go read these couple articles. They don't take a whole lot of time to read it. The one that I think is almost the most interesting, though, and tells us, come back here, come here, mouse, is there's one I actually grabbed from Tech Republic. And I get a lot of stuff from Tech Republic. I really like them. So this is a couple months old, so it's not quite in date, but here we're actually talking about what do I do to defend myself? What can I possibly do to figure that out? So there's some recommendations in there. So the particular software from SolarWinds was something called Orion. So if you're running Orion, I would update it to the latest, hopefully not compromised version. But you're going to have to look for a lot of access controls. And if you don't have a really good inventory, so you don't know what's even in there, and quite frankly, most companies don't have a clue what's on their network. You should probably be finding it out. Default credentials. In fact, I'm going to argue you should probably change all the credentials to everything especially those that you're using default. If you have admin on anything on that network, make it go away. I would unplug any untrusted third-party things. What do I mean by untrusted third party? I will tell you one that frightens me are all these companies that have cheap overseas made in China DVRs because they're easily compromised. Get them off your network or put them somewhere secure. So there's lots of those. Think about the idea of multi-factor. So multi-factor has that advantage. It's a little harder to get into that system if my login credentials require me to not only have a password, but have a code or a key or a device that's been authenticated. So it can make life a little harder. We're switching from convenience to the security model, so you're going to make people mad. Well, I didn't have to do this last year. Well, no kidding. But we need to be doing it now. So, 10 years ago, I didn't have to, or 20, I guess at this point, I didn't have to take off my shoes to go board an airplane. But somebody decided they were going to fill their shoes with explosive, and now we all take our shoes off, right? The other piece is this idea of least privilege. So, and this is where you start to make everybody mad. So unless somebody actually has a need for a file, for a service, for an application, cut them off. So part of this is not a bad thing to look at from a company when you do an audit and say, you know what, I think we've got far too many copies of, and I'll pick on AutoCAD, we've got far too many copies of AutoCAD running. Most of the people that have it on their desktop aren't running it. We've done it here at our college, looking at programs like, what's the name of the data collection tool? SAP and some of the other ones we've looked at, but Mathematica, so some of these other tools that are very expensive a year. Why do we have them? So we've gotten rid of some of them in some cases. We said, here we're going to get rid of that. We've moved to a model where we can increase and decrease the numbers of licenses for Access and Office and all these programs very flexibly. So least privilege. At one point, when we logged into things like our student information system, we were given a lot of information. I could go look at other classes, I could look at instructors, I could look at other students, and we've cut that down significantly. And it's that idea of least privilege. There are times it'd be like, hey, I wanted to see who was in this class, or, man, I bet if I looked, I could find out what Janae's balance is on her. But we can't do that, and that's actually good. We want to restrict that. Even in the IT department, you think, well, we need to come up with strategies. How do I keep people from seeing things, even though they have to work on them? And we can actually do that in a lot of cases. So I still think, though, if I owned a company and I knew that I had been using this software, and I knew that I was one of those 18,000 victims, I'd probably be paranoid out of my living daylights, and I would probably try to start wiping things one by one. The problem is you kind of have to do it all at once. If I try to go through in waves, I redo all the servers, and even then, I'm not sure that I would ever trust that hardware, because there are enough places now. So when we have like the UEFI BIOSes and some of those, they actually have quite a bit of storage. Did they find a infiltration that can live even past a disk formatting? They were in there long enough. Tools are available to do that. And maybe I sound like I should have some tinfoil on my head. But unfortunately, I think this one's going to turn out to be one of the largest attacks we've ever had. And it's not getting a lot of press, which I think is interesting. There's some political components. I know when Donald Trump kind of downplayed it, and it's not getting a lot of, so it's showing up kind of bits and pieces. And I thought it would have blown up by now in terms of the media, and it kind of hasn't, which almost scares me more, that there are companies out there. I don't care. Grab the TV. Are you going to hang it in my bedroom and the house? No, that's okay. It's okay. Just interrupt our class to steal our TV. Those are what I'm hopefully If I can, I just got to get Kevin's budget instead of mine, and replace the projectors and put. That was a. Are there? Is that a 74? I wasn't sure which. Yeah. 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 All right. Sorry about that, everybody, but that's okay. So this is where I want to leave us with today. I want to think about how do we secure those environments around us from the administrative side. Virtualization's great. But anything we add in terms of complexity, we have to realize that somebody has to understand what's going on, and it has to be planned out. If we just willy-nilly install things, we don't know what those entry points are. If we start having people plug in devices all over the place, so great, now you've got an Amazon Alexa in your office. Is it really properly secured? Maybe I said, man, I need Wi-Fi, and this company Wi-Fi isn't working for me. So I'm going to plug in my Belkin router and Wi-Fi from my house, plug it in my office. Well, what you may have done is opened up a back door for somebody to come in there. So to finish a story I started a while ago about seeing that very thing in Kansas City, somebody in one of the executive offices plugged in. I don't remember if it was a Belkin or a Linksys, but it was an open Wi-Fi router. And from my hotel room down in this Hilton Garden, I was able to surf all over this network and play around. One of the things I did was I installed every printer that was on their network really quickly, and I printed them a letter that showed up on every printer on that floor. Last time I went down there, though, do you want to guess what's still up and running? I sent a email and a letter to corporate saying, hey, you should probably fix this. I printed out stuff on their printers, sent another email and a letter, and when I went down not too long ago, I didn't feel bad at all about stealing their Wi-Fi because it was better than the Hilton's Wi-Fi. Because somebody, so I'm going to guess across there, whoever did this is high enough up in the company that they can kind of hide this, unfortunately. Now, I didn't do anything malicious. I printed, which wasn't horrible, but it kind of shows some of the issues that we can have out there. That entire corporate network compromised because somebody decided they needed Wi-Fi for some device that apparently corporate wasn't letting them onto. All right, so there's an assignment. There is a simulation. I will say I had one weird issue. So if you run into this is my solution. At the end of the simulation are some questions. Except when I tried to do it, it didn't show me the question, which was kind of nice. I had to resize the screen, and I had to shrink it to actually, which makes no sense, but that's how I got the questions to pop up. Some days, Cengage, I understand what's happening. Some days I just shake my head a little bit. So I think there's 5 questions in there at the end of that. So take a look at that. All right, have a great weekend. I think we're going to actually have we're not 30 degrees below zero. Knock on wood, and actually by the time we have our break in another week, it'll hopefully be decent out. Hopefully. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. Oh, did you? Okay, great.